Nolan Mercer's private jet touched down nearly 4 hours ahead of schedule. He smiled as the wheels met the runway. For once, the billionaire who spent more time in boardrooms and private terminals than at home would surprise the woman who had stood beside him through every chapter of his life. But less than an hour later, he found his black adoptive mother living in a carport behind the mansion he had bought for her. Her clothes were packed into plastic bins. Her medicine sat beside a portable heater, and when he asked what happened, Ruth looked toward the house and whispered, "Please don't tell Celia I spoke to you." In that moment, Nolan knew someone had taken far more than her room. Welcome to today's story. If you enjoy emotional drama and shocking twists, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more unforgettable stories. And before we begin, let me know where you're watching from in the comments. 3 months earlier, Nolan still believed success had solved the hardest problems of his life. At 44, Nolan Mercer had become one of the most recognizable names in the aviation technology industry. Financial magazines called him visionary. Investors called him brilliant. Competitors called him dangerous. The only person who still called him Noli was Ruth Bellamy. She was 72 now, retired, stubborn, and one of the few people in the world who never seemed impressed by his money. When Nolan purchased a sprawling estate in Napa Valley 2 years earlier, he had insisted Ruth move in. The property included a separate guest wing overlooking vineyards and rolling hills. "You've taken care of everyone else your whole life," he had told her. "Now let someone take care of you." At least, that was what he thought he was doing. The truth was that Nolan spent most of his life traveling. Singapore, London, Dubai, Tokyo. Entire months disappeared into acquisitions, conferences, and negotiations. He called Ruth often. He paid every bill. He made sure she never needed anything financially, and somehow that had convinced him everything was fine. His latest trip had taken him across Asia for nearly 7 weeks. The acquisition closed ahead of schedule, and he decided not to tell anyone he was coming home early. Not Celia, not the staff, not even Ruth. He imagined showing up with flowers and watching her laugh at his dramatic entrance. Instead, his surprise became theirs. The black SUV rolled through the estate gates just after sunset. The mansion looked perfect from the outside. Every light glowed warmly. The gardens were immaculate. Nothing suggested a problem. Then Nolan noticed something unusual near the detached carport behind the main house. A lamp was on. At first he assumed a groundskeeper was working late, but as he walked closer he slowed. There was a folding chair, a small side table, a portable heater, plastic storage bins stacked against the wall, and sitting beneath a blanket in the corner was Ruth. For a second his brain refused to process what he was seeing. "Mom?" Ruth looked up sharply. The surprise on her face was genuine. "Nolan?" He hurried toward her. "What are you doing out here?" She stood too quickly, clearly nervous. "Oh, I was just getting some fresh air." Nolan stared around the carport. Fresh air did not explain the bins, or the heater, or the reading lamp, or the medications lined up beside a thermos. His chest tightened. "Why are your things out here?" Ruth glanced toward the mansion. It was a quick look, almost automatic, but Nolan noticed it. "I'm fine," she said softly. "You're living here." No, it's temporary." "How temporary?" She didn't answer. The silence felt wrong. Everything about this felt wrong. This was the woman who should have been sitting beside a fireplace inside a luxury estate. Instead, she looked like someone afraid of being caught. Nolan lowered his voice. "Who moved you out here?" Ruth pressed her lips together. Again her eyes shifted toward the house. Then she took a small step closer. "Please," she whispered, "don't tell Celia I spoke to you." The words hit him harder than anything else, not because of what she said, because of how she said it. Fear, real fear. Before he could respond, the back door of the mansion opened. Celia appeared on the patio, elegant as always. Perfect hair, perfect smile, perfect timing. "Nolan." She walked toward him with practiced surprise. "You didn't tell us you were coming home." She kissed his cheek. Then her eyes briefly landed on Ruth, only for a second, but Nolan noticed that too. "Looks like you found Ruth enjoying her little outdoor retreat," Celia said lightly. "Retreat?" Nolan asked. "She likes her independence." Ruth looked down. Celia continued smiling. "She spends hours out here reading. You know how she is." The explanation sounded polished, too polished. Nolan looked back at the plastic bins, the heater, the blanket, the medicine. None of it looked temporary. None of it looked voluntary. and none of it looked like independence. It looked like exile. Celia gently slipped her arm through his. "You must be exhausted. Come inside." Nolan didn't move. Instead, he turned toward the main house. His eyes traveled automatically to the guest wing on the second floor, the wing he had personally renovated for Ruth, the wing that was supposed to be hers. Something caught his attention, a heavy brass lock, installed on the outside of the guest suite door. Nolan felt his stomach drop. Because whatever was happening in this house, it was far worse than a woman sleeping in a carport. Someone had locked Ruth out of her own room. Nolan stood frozen beneath the warm glow of the patio lights. The brass lock remained in place on the guest suite door, not inside, outside, exactly where it would be if someone wanted to keep a person from entering rather than keep intruders out. He felt Celia's hand tighten slightly around his arm. "You're staring at a door," she said with a light laugh. "You look like you've discovered a crime scene." Nolan kept his eyes on the lock. "When was this installed?" Celia shrugged. "A few months ago." "Why? The room isn't being used." The answer came too quickly. He finally turned toward her. "Not being used?" Ruth said she preferred spending time downstairs. The guest wing became wasted space. Ruth lowered her head. Again she said nothing. That silence bothered Nolan more than any accusation could have. For 25 years he had known Ruth as someone who spoke her mind. She was polite but never timid. If she disagreed with something, everyone knew it. The woman standing beside the carport tonight felt different, smaller, careful, almost cautious, as if every word carried consequences. Nolan forced a smile. "I'm exhausted," he said. "Let's go inside." Relief flashed across Celia's face so quickly she probably thought nobody noticed, but he did, and that made him even more uneasy. The mansion looked exactly as he remembered, the marble floors, the crystal chandeliers, the expensive artwork lining the walls. Everything looked perfect. Too perfect. A strange feeling settled into Nolan's stomach. The house looked like a luxury magazine spread. Yet the woman who meant more to him than the entire property had been sleeping beside a car. During dinner, Celia filled the silence with stories about charity events, investors, and local social gatherings. Nolan barely listened. His attention kept drifting toward Ruth. She sat quietly. She barely touched her food, and every time she reached for something, she glanced toward Celia first. The behavior felt rehearsed, conditioned. It was the behavior of someone who had learned to avoid conflict. After nearly an hour, Nolan set down his fork. Mom, Ruth looked up. "How long have you been staying in the carport?" The room instantly became silent. Celia answered before Ruth could. "Not staying. Spending time." Nolan ignored her. He kept looking at Ruth. "How long?" Several seconds passed. "About 6 months." The answer hit him like a punch. 6 months, half a year. Half a year while he flew across continents believing she was enjoying the guest suite he had designed specifically for her. Nolan slowly leaned back in his chair. 6 months. Ruth looked embarrassed, as though she had done something wrong. His chest tightened. No, this wasn't embarrassment. It was shame, and somebody had taught her to feel it. Celia sighed dramatically. "You're making this sound much worse than it is, am I?" "Nolan, she's independent. She likes having her own space. Outside?" The question landed harder than he intended. Celia's smile faltered. Only briefly, then it returned. "The weather is beautiful most of the year." Nobody spoke after that. The silence became unbearable. Finally, Ruth excused herself and quietly left the room. Nolan watched her go. Something was deeply wrong, and everyone in the room knew it. Everyone except him, or perhaps he was the last person to realize it. Later that night, long after Celia had gone upstairs, Nolan wandered through the house alone. His footsteps echoed through empty hallways. The estate had once felt like proof that he had succeeded. Tonight it felt enormous and lonely. He stopped outside the guest wing. The lock remained in place. The polished brass reflected the hallway lights. For several moments he simply stared. Then he reached into a nearby cabinet. The spare maintenance keys were exactly where they had always been. He selected one and inserted it into the lock. The mechanism clicked. The door opened. Nolan stepped inside. The room he had built for Ruth no longer existed. The bedroom remained, but everything else had changed. The reading corner Ruth loved was gone. The family photographs were gone. The bookshelves were gone. The quilt she kept folded on her chair was gone. In their place stood white leather furniture, glass display tables, designer decorations. shelves filled with luxury skincare products and champagne glasses. The suite had been transformed into an elegant private lounge. Not Ruth's room, Celia's. Nolan walked slowly through the space. Every trace of Ruth had vanished, not reduced, not moved, erased. He opened closets, empty. He checked drawers, nothing. Even the framed photograph Ruth kept beside her bed had disappeared. A cold feeling settled over him. This wasn't redecorating. It felt deliberate, systematic, as though someone wanted visitors to forget Ruth had ever lived there. A quiet voice interrupted his thoughts. "Mr. Mercer?" Nolan turned. Marta Alvarez stood in the doorway. She had worked at the estate for nearly 8 years, long before Celia began managing household staff. "Marta," she looked nervous, very nervous. Her eyes repeatedly drifted toward the hallway behind her. "You shouldn't be in here right now." "Why?" She hesitated, then closed the door behind her. The action immediately told Nolan this conversation mattered. Mrs. Mercer doesn't like people discussing the guest wing. Nolan's expression hardened. "What happened here?" Marta swallowed. For a moment she looked as though she might leave. Instead she took a deep breath. Mrs. Ruth didn't move directly to the carport. Nolan frowned. "What do you mean?" "First she lost the suite." Marta's voice dropped lower. "Then she was moved into a smaller room near the laundry area." Nolan stared at her. She continued. 3 months later she was moved again. Near the maintenance corridor. The words felt unreal. Marta looked down, and 6 months ago she was relocated to the carport. Nolan felt his pulse pounding. 3 moves, not one decision. 3, step by step, each one taking something away: comfort, privacy, dignity, belonging. His throat felt dry. "Why didn't anyone tell me?" Marta's eyes filled with sadness. "Most of us assumed you knew." The answer hurt more than he expected. Because it made sense. He paid every bill, owned every square foot of the property, signed every payroll check. Everyone naturally assumed he approved what happened. For the first time that night, Nolan felt anger turning inward. Maybe Celia had done this, but he had been gone, again and again and again. He had handed responsibility to other people and called it trust. Marta glanced toward the hallway. Then she leaned closer. "There is something else." Nolan looked up immediately. "What?" Her voice became barely audible. "Mrs. Mercer has been collecting documents." "What kind of documents?" Marta hesitated. The fear on her face returned. The same fear he had seen in Ruth. The same fear that suddenly seemed to exist everywhere in the house. Finally she whispered the words. "Paperwork to prove Mrs. Ruth is mentally unfit." The room went completely silent. And for the first time since arriving home, Nolan realized this was no longer about a stolen room. Someone was building a case against his mother. Someone was building a case against his mother. The sentence stayed with Nolan long after Marta left the guest suite. He remained standing in the middle of the room that had once belonged to Ruth. The expensive furniture suddenly looked ugly. The designer lamps, the champagne shelves, the polished glass tables, they all felt like evidence. Not legal evidence, moral evidence, proof that someone had been erased piece by piece. Nolan pulled out his phone and took photographs. The locked door, the transformed room, the empty closets, every detail. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking like a CEO. He was thinking like a man who had missed something important. Very important. When he finally entered the master bedroom, Celia was sitting on the edge of the bed scrolling through her tablet. She looked up and smiled. "There you are." Nolan studied her face. For years that smile had reassured him. Tonight it felt different, measured, careful. "What were you doing upstairs?" she asked, looking around. Something flickered in her eyes, only for a second, then it disappeared. "You always get restless after a flight." Nolan nodded. "Why didn't you tell me Ruth moved out of the guest suite?" Celia sighed, as if they were discussing furniture placement. "We've been over this." "No, you've talked. I've listened." The room became quiet. Celia set down her tablet. "Nolan, your mother is getting older." "My mother." The correction came automatically. "Not your mother, my mother." He noticed she didn't repeat the phrase. "Older people change," Celia continued. "They want different things. Different things like sleeping in a carport." The words landed hard, her expression tightened. "You keep using that word, because that's where she lives. Temporarily." 6 months isn't temporary. For the first time, irritation broke through her polished exterior. "You've been home for less than 12 hours. And already I've learned more than I did during the last year." The silence that followed felt dangerous. Eventually Celia stood. "I'm going to bed." She walked past him, then stopped at the door. If you're planning to interfere, at least understand the full situation first. Before Nolan could ask what that meant, she left. The statement bothered him. Interfere, not help, not understand. Interfere. As though protecting Ruth would somehow be an obstacle. Nolan barely slept. At 6 in the morning, he drove into downtown Napa. The person he called wasn't a private investigator. Not yet. First, he needed facts. He needed someone who dealt with legal realities instead of family emotions. Priya Shah had been his attorney for almost a decade. Smart, careful, impossible to intimidate. If something illegal was happening, she would know where to look. When he arrived at her office, she listened without interrupting. He described the carport, the guest suite, the lock, the comments from Marta, the alleged concerns about Ruth's mental state. Priya took notes. When he finished, she folded her hands. Has anyone filed a conservatorship petition? Not that I know of. Then we start there. She opened her laptop. There are public records we can search. Within minutes, she began reviewing filings. Nothing appeared immediately. No active conservatorship case. No guardianship petition. No court order. Nolan felt slight relief. It lasted less than 30 seconds. Priya leaned closer to the screen. What? She clicked on a document. This isn't a filing. What is it? A consultation request. Nolan frowned. A law office submitted preliminary intake notes about a potential conservatorship matter. His stomach tightened. Whose name? Priya read quietly, then looked up. Ruth Bellamy. For several moments neither spoke. The consultation wasn't enough to start legal proceedings, but it proved something. Celia hadn't merely complained about Ruth. She had spoken with professionals. She had taken steps, real steps. Can they do that without my knowledge? Nolan asked. They can ask questions. Priya closed the document. The important question is whether the claims are legitimate. Nolan immediately thought of the previous evening. The way Ruth remembered dates, names, conversations, details. Nothing about her behavior suggested cognitive decline. Priya seemed to reach the same conclusion. When was Ruth's last medical evaluation? Nolan blinked. I don't know. The answer embarrassed him. A son should know. Yet he didn't, because he had trusted everyone else to manage the details. Priya noticed his expression. Find out. An hour later, Nolan had his answer. The evaluation had happened only 4 months earlier. At Ruth's annual appointment, the physician's office couldn't release records immediately without authorization. But they confirmed one thing: no diagnosis of dementia, no cognitive impairment findings, no recommendation for assisted living, nothing. The narrative was already falling apart. Back at the estate, Nolan found Ruth sitting beneath the carport reading an old mystery novel. The sight made his chest ache. She smiled when she saw him, a small smile, the kind that carried exhaustion. You went somewhere? He sat beside her. I met with my attorney. The reaction was immediate. Fear. Not surprise, fear. Why? Because somebody is claiming you're mentally unfit. Ruth looked away. The book closed slowly in her hands. You shouldn't get involved. The word stunned him. Get involved? Nolan, no. His voice remained gentle but firm. No more avoiding this. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind moved softly through the vineyard beyond the estate. Finally, Ruth sighed. Celia thinks she's helping. Nolan stared at her. Helping who? Ruth didn't answer. That silence told him everything. Even now, she was protecting someone. Maybe Celia, maybe him, maybe both. But she wasn't protecting herself. That evening, Nolan made another decision. Instead of confronting Celia, he quietly reviewed security access records from the estate's internal system. As owner of the property, he could access historical logs. The system tracked keycard entries into restricted storage areas. At first, he found nothing unusual. Then he searched Ruth's former storage room. His eyes narrowed. There were dozens of access attempts. Not entries. Attempts. Repeated failed attempts. Late nights. Early mornings. Weekends. The same user profile appeared again and again. Celia Mercer. Nolan leaned closer. 23 failed attempts over 5 months. Whoever made them had been trying to enter something locked. Something they couldn't access. His pulse quickened. He continued reviewing the logs. The attempts always occurred near the same storage locker, the same section, the same secured cabinet. He opened the inventory records attached to the space. Most items were ordinary, old books, personal documents, medical records. Then one item caught his attention. Storage box B17. Owner Ruth Bellamy. Status: locked, Special instruction, do not discard. Nolan stared at the screen, a single locked box, 23 failed access attempts, months of effort, and suddenly the entire situation looked different. Maybe the carport wasn't the objective. Maybe the humiliation wasn't the objective. Maybe even the conservatorship wasn't the objective. Maybe all of it was leading toward something else. Something inside box B17. As he continued reading, he noticed one final entry attached to the inventory file. A handwritten note had been scanned years earlier and uploaded into the estate archive. The note contained only one sentence. If anything happens to me, this box must never be opened without Nolan present. Nolan felt the blood drain from his face, because the signature at the bottom wasn't recent. Ruth had written it long before she ever moved into the mansion. Nolan stared at the scanned note for nearly a full minute. The date at the bottom made it worse. It had been written almost 8 years ago, long before the move to Napa, long before the mansion, long before Celia had ever suggested Ruth relocate to California. Whatever was inside box B17, Ruth had been protecting it for years and she had expected trouble. That realization refused to leave him. The next morning, he skipped breakfast entirely and headed straight to the estate's storage building. The structure sat near the back vineyard, hidden behind maintenance garages and landscaping equipment. Most homeowners would have used it for seasonal decorations and spare furniture. Ruth's belongings occupied only one corner. The space was neat, organized. Every box carried handwritten labels, winter clothes, medical records, tax documents, volunteer work. Everything reflected the same person Nolan had known his entire life, careful, methodical, impossible to intimidate when it came to keeping records. Box B17 sat on the highest shelf, small, gray, ordinary, the kind of box nobody would notice twice, yet somehow it had become the center of everything. Nolan climbed the ladder and carefully brought it down. The lock remained intact. No visible damage, no signs of forced entry. He placed it on a nearby work table and examined it. Then he noticed something attached beneath the handle. A folded envelope. His name was written across the front. Not Mr. Mercer, not Nolan Mercer, just Nolan. His pulse quickened. He carefully opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. If you're reading this, something has already gone wrong. The words instantly tightened his chest. The rest was written in Ruth's familiar handwriting. There is nothing dangerous inside this box. There is no money, no jewelry, and nothing anyone should be afraid of. There is only the truth. If people start asking questions about this box, protect it before you open it. The truth matters only if it survives long enough to be heard. Nolan read the note twice. Then a third time. No explanation, no details, only a warning. He slipped the letter into his jacket pocket. The box remained unopened for now. Something told him Ruth wanted him to understand more before looking inside, and for the first time he trusted that instinct. Later that afternoon, Nolan requested copies of estate security footage. Not months of recordings, just enough to answer one question. Who had been trying to access Ruth's storage area? The footage confirmed what the access logs already suggested. Celia appeared repeatedly, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by a member of household staff, always after midnight, always near Ruth's storage section. In one recording, she spent nearly 20 minutes searching shelves and opening containers. The expression on her face wasn't curiosity, it was urgency, desperation, as though she believed something important was hidden there. Nolan saved every clip. Then he backed them up in 3 separate locations. Years in business had taught him one lesson. Evidence only mattered if nobody could make it disappear. That evening he finally confronted Ruth. She sat beneath the carport reading while the sun disappeared behind the vineyards. The setting should have felt peaceful. Instead, it looked heartbreaking. A 72-year-old woman sitting beside storage bins because nobody inside the mansion wanted her there. Nolan pulled up a chair beside her. I found the box. Ruth froze, only slightly, but he saw it, her eyes lowered toward the book in her lap. You weren't supposed to. I didn't open it. That got her attention. Slowly she looked up. For the first time in days, some of the tension left her face. You didn't? No. A long silence followed. Then she nodded. Thank you. The response surprised him. Not relief that he knew. Relief that he had waited. What is in it? Ruth stared toward the distant hills. The reason people become afraid. Nolan frowned. That's not an answer. No. A sad smile appeared. It isn't. The wind moved through the vineyard. Somewhere nearby, irrigation systems clicked on. For a few moments neither spoke. Then Ruth quietly asked, "Did Celia find it?" "No." "Good." The answer came too fast. Too honestly, Nolan noticed immediately. Whatever secret existed, Ruth feared Celia discovering it more than she feared Nolan learning it. That changed everything. Why is she looking for it? Ruth's fingers tightened around her book. "You should ask her." "I am asking you." Another silence. Then Ruth slowly closed the book. Her expression changed, not fearful. Tired, deeply tired. Asking the right question doesn't mean you're ready for the answer. The words lingered long after the conversation ended. That night, Nolan found himself unable to sleep again. The estate felt different now. Every hallway seemed to contain hidden tensions. Every room carried questions. Shortly after midnight, his phone vibrated. It was Priya. "Nolan, I found something." He immediately sat up. "What?" "I tracked down the consultation records connected to the conservatorship inquiry." His grip tightened around the phone. "What did you find?" "The inquiry wasn't filed by Celia personally." That surprised him. "Then who initiated it?" "There was an intermediary." Priya paused. "I also found references to a financial review." Nolan frowned. "What kind of review?" "Asset identification." The words hit him immediately. This was about money? Maybe. Priya didn't sound convinced. The strange part is what they were searching for. Nolan stood and walked toward the window. Outside, the estate lay silent beneath the moonlight. What were they searching for? Paper shuffled on the other end. Then Priya read directly from the notes. "Client believes protected individual may possess historical records linked to inheritance interests and adoption documentation." Nolan's heartbeat quickened. Adoption documentation. The phrase felt completely out of place. What adoption documentation? That's the problem. Priya exhaled. "The notes don't explain." For several seconds, Nolan said nothing. The box, the failed access attempts, the conservatorship inquiry, now adoption records. Pieces were starting to connect, but not in a way that made sense. Finally, Priya spoke again. "There was one more thing." Nolan's stomach tightened. "What?" "The attorney handling the consultation asked for records from a specific organization." Which organization?" Priya read the name. The moment he heard it, Nolan felt a chill run through him. Because it wasn't a financial institution, it wasn't a hospital, and it wasn't connected to Ruth. It was an adoption agency. An adoption agency that had processed part of Nolan's own adult adoption records decades earlier. And somebody had deliberately gone looking for those files. Nolan remained awake long after the call ended. The adoption agency's name echoed through his mind. He hadn't thought about it in years, not because it wasn't important, because he had convinced himself the past no longer mattered. He had built a company, built a life, built a future, yet somehow that agency had found its way back into the center of everything, and now it was connected to Ruth, to Celia, to the locked box, and to a campaign that seemed designed to make Ruth disappear. By sunrise, he had already made another decision. He was done reacting. It was time to start investigating. 3 hours later, Nolan sat across from Priya in a conference room overlooking downtown Napa. Stacks of printed documents covered the table. Corporate records, archived legal filings, historical registration reports. Nothing dramatic, nothing explosive, just paper. But Nolan knew from experience that entire empires rose and fell because of paper. Priya slid a folder across the table. "I found corporate records connected to the agency." Nolan opened it. The agency had operated for decades before quietly dissolving. Nothing unusual at first glance. Then he noticed several law firms listed as outside counsel. One name appeared repeatedly. Wexler and Associates. Nolan froze. Celia's maiden name was Wexler. He looked up slowly. "Tell me that's a coincidence." Priya didn't answer immediately, which told him everything. "I don't believe it is." Nolan's stomach tightened. "How involved were they? We don't know yet." Priya pointed towards several highlighted sections. "But the firm's name appears consistently during a period when records from the agency began disappearing." The room suddenly felt smaller. Nolan looked back at the documents. Years ago, he would have dismissed this as circumstantial. Now he couldn't. Too many pieces were already connected. Too many questions led back to the same place. The agency, the box, the conservatorship, the Wexler family. When he returned home that afternoon, the estate felt strangely quiet. Several house staff members were preparing for an upcoming charity event Celia planned to host later in the month. Luxury rental companies arrived with floral samples. Caterers came and went. Everything looked normal. Everything looked successful. Yet beneath the polished surface, Nolan could now see tension everywhere. People lowered their voices when Celia entered a room. Staff members became cautious around Ruth. The entire household seemed organized around unspoken rules, and nobody wanted to discuss them, not openly. He found Ruth in the vineyard walking slowly between the rows. For the first time since his return, she wasn't sitting beside the carport. The sight brought him unexpected relief. At least she was outside because she wanted to be, not because she had nowhere else to go. "Mind if I join you?" She smiled softly. "You're asking permission on your own property?" He matched her smile. "Maybe I've spent too many years acting like everything belongs to me." Something about that answer made her look at him differently, more carefully, as though she recognized the guilt beneath it. They walked together in silence for several moments. The vineyard stretched toward distant hills painted gold by late afternoon sunlight. Finally, Nolan spoke. "I found connections between the adoption agency and the Wexler family." Ruth stopped walking. The reaction was immediate, far stronger than anything he had seen before. Her face lost color. Not fear, recognition. That was worse. "You already know, don't you?" She looked away. "Nolan, you know something." The words came out quietly. Not angry, just tired, deeply tired. For years he had trusted that the people closest to him would tell him the truth. Now every answer seemed hidden behind another locked door. Ruth resumed walking, slowly, carefully. "The truth doesn't arrive all at once. I'm not asking for all of it." They stopped again. This time Ruth looked directly at him, and what he saw in her eyes unsettled him. Regret, not for herself, for him. "There are things about that agency that should have been exposed years ago." "Then why weren't they?" A painful silence followed. Finally she answered. "Because powerful people were afraid." The words landed heavily. Nolan immediately thought of old money families, political donors, influential attorneys, people who controlled reputations, people like the Wexlers. Before he could ask another question, Ruth surprised him. "You need to understand something." Her voice softened. "I never kept those records because I wanted leverage." "What records?" "I kept them because people deserved the truth." That answer created more questions than it solved. But one thing became clear: the box wasn't about inheritance, or blackmail, or money. At least not to Ruth. To her, it was about preserving something, protecting something. The problem was that someone else seemed terrified of that same truth surviving. That evening, Nolan reviewed another set of documents Priya had sent. One file stood out immediately. It contained archived correspondence related to the agency's final years. Most of it was heavily redacted. Large sections blacked out, names removed, addresses hidden, yet a few details remained. Enough to be interesting, enough to be dangerous. Near midnight, Nolan found a reference to an internal review. Several files had reportedly disappeared during an investigation. Witness statements, placement records, financial documents, all missing. The report never identified who removed them, but a handwritten notation had been scanned into the margin. Records possibly copied before destruction. Nolan sat upright. Copied, not destroyed, copied. His pulse accelerated, because suddenly Ruth's box made sense. What if she wasn't protecting original records? What if she had preserved copies? Evidence someone thought had vanished forever. Evidence that powerful people believed no longer existed. A knock interrupted his thoughts. He looked up. Marta stood outside his office door. She appeared nervous. More nervous than usual. "Mr. Mercer, what is it?" She stepped inside and closed the door. That alone told him something was wrong. "I wasn't sure if I should tell you." His stomach tightened. "Tell me what?" Marta glanced toward the hallway before speaking. "I saw Mrs. Mercer this afternoon." "Celia?" "Yes," Marta swallowed, then lowered her voice. She wasn't searching the storage area anymore. Nolan frowned. "Then what was she doing?" Marta hesitated. For a moment it looked like she might change her mind. Then she finally spoke. "I saw her talking to a man near the service entrance." "What man? I don't know. Did you hear anything?" Marta nodded slowly. "Only one sentence." The room felt completely still. "What did she say?" Marta's answer sent a chill through him. She said, "If Ruth still has the copies, we need to find them before Nolan learns what my family did." Nolan did not sleep. After Marta left his office, he replayed her words over and over. If Ruth still has the copies, we need to find them before Nolan learns what my family did. Not what Celia did, what my family did. The distinction mattered. It shifted everything. Until now, Nolan had believed Celia's cruelty was the central problem. Now it looked like the cruelty might have been a symptom of something much older. Something buried long before their marriage. Something connected to the Wexler name itself. At 6 the next morning, Nolan called Priya. I need everything on the Wexlers. That's a broad request. Then narrow it. He stood in his office overlooking the vineyard. Start with the adoption agency. Legal counsel. Internal investigations, missing records, anything. Priya was silent for a moment. Then she spoke carefully. You're getting close to something, aren't you? I think Ruth has been protecting evidence. And Celia? Nolan looked toward the distant carport. I think Celia has been trying to destroy it. 3 hours later, Priya called back. This time her voice sounded different, more cautious. I found something. Nolan immediately closed his laptop. What? The attorney who represented the agency during its final years. Let me guess. Priya sighed. Richard Wexler, Celia's father. The answer landed exactly where Nolan expected, and somehow it still felt worse hearing it out loud. How involved was he? We don't know. But there was an internal review conducted shortly before the agency dissolved. Nolan waited. The review focused on irregular records. His stomach tightened. What kind of irregular records? Adult adoption files. Nolan felt a chill. His own adoption history involved adult proceedings, legally straightforward, yet somehow that same category kept appearing again and again. What happened to the review? Officially? Priya paused. It disappeared. Nolan closed his eyes. Of course it had. Everything important seemed to disappear. Records, letters, evidence, truth. The only reason anything still existed was because Ruth refused to throw things away. By late afternoon, Nolan decided he needed answers from the one person who seemed determined not to provide them. He found Celia in the main house supervising preparations for the upcoming charity gala. The irony almost made him laugh. The event's theme was dignity for seniors. Waiters moved expensive decorations through the ballroom. Designers adjusted floral arrangements worth more than many people's monthly salaries. Meanwhile, Ruth still slept beside a portable heater. The hypocrisy was becoming impossible to ignore. Celia noticed him watching. You look serious. I am. The smile disappeared from her face. Several staff members quietly excused themselves. Within moments, they were alone. Nolan stepped closer. I want to know why your father worked for the adoption agency. For a fraction of a second, genuine shock crossed her face. Then it vanished. Too late. He had seen it. I don't know what you're talking about. That's not true. Nolan, don't. His voice remained calm. That seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. I am tired of being lied to. The room became very still. Celia crossed her arms. My father represented dozens of organizations. This one seems important to you, to Ruth. Something changed behind her eyes. A reaction she couldn't fully suppress. Fear. Not for herself, for what might be revealed. That frightened Nolan more than anything else, because guilty people feared consequences. But people protecting family secrets feared exposure, and exposure often meant something bigger. You need to let this go. The sentence surprised him, not because of what she said, because of how she said it, almost pleading, almost desperate. Why? Celia looked away. For several moments she said nothing. Then she quietly answered, because some things destroy lives. Nolan stared at her. Whose life? No answer. That silence spoke louder than any confession. Eventually she walked away, conversation over. Or so she believed. For Nolan, it had only begun. That evening he drove into town and visited a retired journalist Priya had recommended. Walter Briggs had spent nearly 30 years investigating public corruption across Northern California. If anyone remembered a forgotten scandal, it would be him. Walter's house looked more like an archive than a home. Boxes filled every room, newspapers covered tables, old case files occupied entire shelves. After listening to Nolan's story, the elderly journalist leaned back slowly. The agency, he nodded. I haven't heard that name in years. Nolan sat forward. You know it? I know rumors. Walter rubbed his chin. Nothing proven. What kind of rumors? The old journalist walked toward a filing cabinet. Several minutes passed. Then he returned carrying a weathered folder. Dust covered the edges. Near the end there were whispers. He opened it, missing records. Nolan nodded. I know about those. Walter shook his head. No, You know they disappeared. He tapped the folder. I know why some people thought they disappeared. Nolan's pulse accelerated. Walter pulled out an article draft that had never been published. Large sections remained unfinished. Names were omitted. Sources remained anonymous. But one sentence had been underlined. Records removed to conceal connections between prominent families and altered adoption histories. Nolan read it twice, then a third time. Altered? Walter nodded. That was the allegation. Was it true? No idea. The old journalist spread his hands. My source vanished before publication. The sentence landed heavily. Another dead end, another missing witness, another truth buried halfway. Then Walter pulled one final item from the folder. An old photocopy, faded, poor quality, almost unreadable. What's this? Part of the source material? Nolan took it. At first he didn't understand what he was seeing. Then his eyes widened. It was a photograph, not of a child, not of an adoption proceeding. A photograph of several adults attending a fundraising dinner decades earlier. Most faces meant nothing to him, until he noticed one person, Richard Wexler, much younger, standing beside several agency executives. And directly beside him, Nolan froze, his breath caught, because he recognized the woman immediately. Not from newspapers, not from records, from his own life. The woman standing beside Richard Wexler in the photograph was Ruth, and someone had deliberately scratched her face out of the original picture. Nolan stared at the damaged photograph under the yellow light of Walter Briggs's desk lamp. Someone had scratched Ruth's face out deliberately, not torn the picture, not cropped it, targeted her. The marks were deep enough to damage the paper itself. Whoever had done it wanted her erased from the image without removing everyone else. Walter noticed his reaction. You know her? It wasn't a question. Nolan nodded slowly. She's my mother. The old journalist blinked. For the first time since their conversation began, he looked genuinely surprised. The woman in that photograph? Yes. Walter leaned back in silence. Then he carefully took the picture from Nolan's hands. I always assumed she was a former employee. Why? Because that's how she was described in the notes. Nolan's jaw tightened. Described by whom? Walter pointed toward a faded annotation attached to the file. A support worker present during agency fundraising activities. Support worker. The phrase irritated Nolan immediately. The woman who had spent years protecting evidence that powerful people feared had been reduced to a footnote. Yet somehow she had been important enough for someone to erase. That contradiction bothered him. A lot. Before leaving, Nolan requested copies of everything Walter possessed. The journalist agreed. There wasn't much. A few articles, old correspondence, archived notes, fragments. But fragments mattered, especially when someone had spent decades destroying the complete picture. The drive back to Napa felt longer than usual. Questions kept multiplying. Why had Ruth attended events connected to the agency? How had she met Richard Wexler? Why was her face removed from the photograph? And most importantly, why had she never mentioned any of it? By the time Nolan returned to the estate, night had already fallen. The mansion glowed against the darkness. Beautiful, expensive, and increasingly dishonest. He found Ruth sitting alone beside the carport. The portable heater hummed softly beside her chair. The sight immediately reignited his anger. Not at her, at himself. Every time he saw that heater, he remembered how many nights she had spent here while he traveled across the world believing everything was fine. He sat beside her. Neither spoke for several moments. Finally, Nolan removed the photograph from his jacket. Ruth noticed it immediately. The color drained from her face. For a brief moment, she looked older than 72. Not physically, emotionally. As though decades had suddenly landed on her shoulders. Where did you get that? Her voice barely rose above a whisper. Nolan answered carefully. A journalist had it. Ruth took the photograph. Her fingers trembled slightly. Not from fear, from recognition. You knew Richard Wexler. The statement hung between them. Ruth closed her eyes. For several seconds she said nothing. Then she nodded. Yes. The answer hit harder than Nolan expected. Not because of what she admitted, because she admitted it so easily, as if she was finally too tired to deny things anymore. You never told me. No. Why? She looked toward the vineyard, toward the darkness beyond the estate, toward memories Nolan couldn't see. Because I hoped none of this would ever matter again. The answer frustrated him, not because it was dishonest, because it sounded honest, and that made it harder. You attended agency events. Yes, You knew agency executives, some of them you knew Richard. Another pause. Yes, Nolan rubbed his forehead. Every answer created 3 new questions. What were you doing there? For the first time, Ruth didn't answer immediately. Instead, she stared at the damaged photograph, at the scratch marks covering her face. Finally, she spoke. I wasn't supposed to be there. Nolan looked up. What does that mean? A sad smile touched her lips. The same thing it always means. She handed the picture back. Someone forgot I was paying attention. The words lingered. Someone forgot I was paying attention. Suddenly, Nolan understood something important about Ruth. She had never been powerful, never wealthy, never politically connected. People underestimated her because they assumed she didn't matter. And because they underestimated her, they spoke freely around her. They revealed things. They became careless. Maybe that was how she had acquired whatever was hidden inside box B17, not through power, through observation, through patience, through simply being ignored. The realization changed the way Nolan saw everything, including Celia, especially Celia. The next morning he made another decision. He stopped pretending nothing had changed. At breakfast he waited until Celia sat down, then he spoke. Ruth is moving back into the house. The effect was immediate. Celia nearly dropped her coffee cup. What today? Nolan, the guest suite will be restored. Her expression hardened. That isn't your decision alone. For a moment Nolan almost laughed. Not because anything was funny, because the statement revealed how far things had drifted. His mother had been removed from her room, relocated 3 times, pushed into a carport, and somehow Celia still believed she had authority over where Ruth belonged. Actually, Nolan said quietly, it is. The silence that followed felt sharp, dangerous. Several staff members quickly found reasons to leave. Soon only Nolan and Celia remained. You don't understand what you're doing. The sentence sounded familiar. He had heard versions of it repeatedly. From Celia, from Ruth, from everyone. Always the same warning, never an explanation. Then help me understand. Celia stood. Frustration flashed across her face. Then something else appeared. Something rarer. Fear, real fear. You need to stop digging. Why? No answer. Nolan, why? This time his voice carried more force. For several moments she simply stared at him. Finally she spoke. Not as his wife, not as the polished socialite, not as the hostess preparing a charity gala, as a frightened daughter. If those records come out, people will get hurt. The room became completely silent. Nolan rose slowly from his chair. People already got hurt. He turned and walked away. For once he left her with the silence. Not the other way around. That afternoon Priya called again. Her voice carried a level of urgency Nolan hadn't heard before. I found the internal review. Nolan froze. You said it disappeared. It did. So what did you find? A reference. Paper rustled on the other end. One surviving index page. His pulse accelerated. What does it say? Several seconds passed, then Priya answered. There was a protected witness. Nolan's grip tightened around the phone. A witness to what? We don't know. Who was it? Another pause. Then came the answer that changed everything. The witness identification number matches the same number referenced in Ruth's sealed file. Silence. Then Priya spoke again. And Nolan, according to the index, that witness was the person who copied the records before they disappeared. Nolan remained motionless after Priya finished speaking. The witness, the copied records, the identification number tied directly to Ruth. For several seconds he simply stared through the office window at the dark vineyard beyond the glass. Everything he had believed about Ruth was changing. Not the important things, not her kindness, not her integrity, not the years she had spent protecting people who could offer her nothing in return. Those things remained untouched. What changed was his understanding of how much she had carried alone. Can you prove it? He finally asked. Priya's voice remained cautious. Not yet. But you're confident? The reference numbers match. Paper shuffled on her end. Someone intentionally separated the witness identity from the report, but whoever created the index page made a mistake. Nolan listened carefully. The identification code survived, and it belongs to Ruth. That's what the records indicate. After the call ended, Nolan sat quietly for a long time. The answer created a bigger question. If Ruth had copied the records, why had she kept them? Fear wasn't enough. Duty wasn't enough. There had to be something inside those documents worth sacrificing years of peace. Something powerful enough that Celia's family still feared it decades later. The next morning, Nolan made a choice. He stopped treating Ruth as someone who needed to be rescued. Instead, he treated her as the only person who truly understood what was happening. He found her in the cottage garden behind the estate's greenhouse. The staff had already begun moving some of her belongings back into the guest suite. Not everything, not yet, but enough to make a statement. For the first time since his return, Ruth wasn't sitting beside the carport. That alone felt significant. She looked up as he approached. "You look tired, so do you." A faint smile crossed her face. Fair enough. Nolan sat beside her. No accusations, no demands, no photographs, no legal documents. Just honesty. "I know about the witness." The smile disappeared. Not dramatically, quietly, like a door closing, he continued. "I know you copied records before they vanished." Ruth lowered her eyes. For a long moment she remained silent. Then she surprised him. "I wondered when you'd find out." Not denial, not avoidance, acceptance. The response hit harder than any confession. "You really did it, yes." The answer came softly, without pride, without regret, only truth. Nolan leaned forward. "Why?" Ruth studied the flowers growing along the stone pathway. When she finally spoke, her voice sounded distant. Not because she was hiding something, because she was remembering. There were people looking for answers. What answers? Their own. Nolan frowned. Ruth took a slow breath. The agency handled adult adoption cases, reunification requests, missing family inquiries. People spent years trying to locate relatives. She looked at him. Some of those records began disappearing. The words settled heavily between them. Nolan felt his pulse quicken. Disappearing by accident? A bitter smile touched her lips. No. For several seconds, neither spoke. The answer alone revealed more than any lengthy explanation could. Ruth continued. People with influence decided certain stories were inconvenient. The sentence sounded familiar, because it matched everything Nolan had begun discovering. The missing files, the destroyed records, the erased witness reports, the scratched photograph, the campaign against Ruth. All of it pointed toward the same thing: control. Someone had spent years deciding which truths deserved to survive, and which truths deserved to vanish. Did Richard Wexler know? Ruth looked away. That was answer enough, but eventually she nodded. Yes, the name hung in the air: Celia's father, the respected attorney, the family patriarch, the man whose reputation remained untouched, at least for now. Nolan's jaw tightened. Did he order it? I don't know. The answer sounded genuine. That mattered. Ruth never pretended certainty where certainty didn't exist. Then why are they still afraid? This time Ruth hesitated. Longer than before. When she finally answered, Nolan realized they were approaching the edge of something much larger. Because some records were never recovered. The words immediately sharpened his focus. Records connected to what? Ruth looked directly at him, for the first time all morning, and in her eyes Nolan saw the same emotion he had noticed days earlier. Not fear. Concern. Concern for him. That realization disturbed him more than any legal threat, because it suggested the truth might affect him personally. Ruth. Her voice became almost a whisper. Some people built their lives on the assumption those documents were gone. A chill ran through him. Built their lives, not protected their reputations. Built their lives. The difference mattered. A lot. Before he could ask another question, his phone vibrated. Again, Nolan answered immediately. What happened? You need to come to my office. Her tone was unusually urgent. What is it? I received a response from a records archive in Sacramento. Nolan stood. What kind of response? Several seconds passed. Then Priya spoke carefully. One of the missing agency files was partially recovered during a separate investigation years ago. Nolan's pulse accelerated. Recovered? Only fragments. Whose file? The silence stretched. Too long. Much too long. Finally Priya answered. The file contains references to you. Everything inside Nolan seemed to stop. For a moment he wasn't sure he had heard correctly. Me? Yes. His grip tightened around the phone. That's impossible. That's what I thought. Another pause. Then came the sentence that changed everything. The recovered file includes your name, Richard Wexler's name, and a notation indicating that contact requests from a biological relative were blocked. Nolan felt the ground shift beneath him. For years he had assumed no one searched for him, no one wrote, no one asked, no one came looking. Now that assumption was cracking apart. Slowly, dangerously, and somewhere inside a locked gray box, Ruth apparently knew exactly why. Nolan drove to Sacramento before sunrise. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, but his thoughts never left the sentence Priya had spoken. Contact requests from a biological relative were blocked, not ignored, not lost. Blocked. The difference felt enormous. For most of his life, Nolan had built a story around absence. Nobody had come looking. Nobody had wanted him. Ruth had been the only person who chose him and stayed. Now that story was beginning to fracture. When he arrived at Priya's office, she already had several files spread across a conference table. Some were photocopies, others were digital printouts from state archives. None looked complete. That worried him more than if they had found everything. Missing records meant missing intentions, and missing intentions often hid the most important truths. Priya slid a folder toward him. This is all that survived. Nolan opened it. Most pages contained routine administrative information, transfer logs, filing references, internal correspondence. Then he saw his own name, Nolan Mercer. The sight hit him harder than expected. Not because it was surprising, because it appeared inside documents he had never known existed. Documents that had moved through unknown hands decades ago. He continued reading. Several pages referenced inquiries submitted over a span of nearly 8 years. The sender's identity had been redacted, but the pattern was obvious. Someone kept trying again and again. The requests became more urgent over time. Then they stopped. Nolan looked up. Why would someone keep filing requests for years? Priya leaned back. Because they believed the person they were looking for could still be found. The answer landed heavily. He stared at the pages again. Someone had not forgotten him. Someone had continued searching long after most people would have given up. What happened to the requests? Priya pointed toward another section. That's where things get interesting. A handwritten notation appeared beside multiple entries. Reviewed by counsel, the same initials appeared repeatedly. R.W. Nolan already knew who that likely was. Richard Wexler, Celia's father, the man whose shadow seemed to reach into every layer of this story. A cold feeling settled into Nolan's chest. How much influence did he have? Enough. Priya folded her arms. Not enough to legally erase records, but enough to delay, redirect, challenge, or complicate requests. Nolan said nothing, because suddenly another possibility emerged. Maybe Richard Wexler hadn't simply protected a scandal. Maybe he had protected a specific secret, one connected directly to Nolan. By late afternoon, Nolan returned to Napa. Instead of going home, he drove directly to Ruth's cottage. She was sitting on the porch reading. The sight calmed him more than he expected. No matter how complicated the investigation became, Ruth remained the one constant truth. She noticed his expression immediately. You found something. Nolan sat beside her. I think somebody spent years trying to find me. Ruth closed the book slowly. No surprise crossed her face, only sadness. That reaction told him everything. You knew. Ruth looked toward the vineyards, not at first, but later, yes. The words felt like a punch, not because she had lied, because she had carried the burden alone. Who was it? She hesitated, long enough to confirm she knew more. I don't know everything. Tell me what you do know. For several moments she remained silent, then she nodded. There was an adult relative. Nolan's pulse quickened. A relative? Yes. Who? I never learned the full relationship. That sounded believable. Ruth had never exaggerated knowledge she didn't possess. But you knew someone was searching. I knew someone kept sending inquiries. Nolan leaned forward. Why didn't you tell me? Pain crossed her face. Real pain, not defensiveness, not guilt, pain. Because I thought they were dangerous. The answer caught him off guard. Dangerous? Ruth looked directly at him. At the time I didn't know who to trust. The explanation felt incomplete, and they both knew it. Before Nolan could press further, another voice interrupted. Maybe because she wasn't the only one making decisions. Both turned. Celia stood at the edge of the porch. Neither had heard her approach. The tension arrived instantly. For days she had remained mostly isolated within the estate, meeting attorneys, making phone calls, protecting herself. Now she looked exhausted, not defeated, just tired, as if years of pressure had finally become visible. Nolan stood. What are you doing here? Celia ignored the question. Instead she looked at Ruth. For several seconds neither woman spoke. Then Celia quietly said something Nolan never expected. My father lied to me. A silence followed, heavy silence, the kind that changes a room. Nolan frowned. What are you talking about? Celia laughed bitterly. No, you don't get to hear this secondhand. She turned toward Ruth again. He told me the documents only threatened the family name. Ruth remained still. Celia continued. He told me they were embarrassing. Her voice cracked slightly. He never told me they involved real people. Nolan watched carefully. This wasn't an excuse. Not exactly. It felt closer to confession. For the first time since this nightmare began, he saw something beyond arrogance, fear, regret, shame. Not enough to erase what she had done, but enough to make her human again. My entire life, Celia said, I heard the same thing. She looked away. Protect the family. The sentence sounded rehearsed, ancient, inherited. I thought preserving the reputation was more important than understanding the truth. Ruth finally spoke. And now, Celia's eyes filled with tears she seemed determined not to release. Now I think my father was hiding something from everyone. Nolan stared at her. What? I don't know. The answer came immediately, too quickly to be calculated, too quickly to be manipulation. She genuinely didn't know. That realization changed everything. Because if Celia didn't understand the full secret, then somebody higher in the chain still controlled the truth. Somebody who had remained invisible, until now. That evening, Nolan received another call. This time it wasn't Priya. It was a private investigator he had hired 3 days earlier. The investigator sounded unusually tense. I found the person who submitted the inquiries. Nolan immediately closed the door to his study. Who are they? An 81-year-old man named Elias Grant. The name meant nothing to Nolan, yet. Is he alive? Yes. Can I speak to him? A pause followed. Then the investigator answered. That's the problem. Nolan's stomach tightened. What problem? He has been trying to contact you again. The room suddenly felt smaller. Again? Yes. Another pause, longer this time. Then came the part that made Nolan's blood run cold. And according to documents I obtained this afternoon, somebody recently paid to monitor whether he ever succeeded. 3 months after the gala, the headlines had finally started to fade. The investigations had not. State regulators continued reviewing records connected to the old adoption agency scandal. Several former executives faced inquiries regarding destroyed files, obstructed requests, and decades of administrative misconduct. The process moved slowly, as legal processes often did, but it moved. For the first time in years, buried records were being reopened. Adult adoptees who had spent decades searching for answers were receiving phone calls from attorneys and advocacy groups. Some discoveries brought relief, others brought heartbreak, but at least the truth was no longer locked away. Nolan followed every update closely, not because he wanted revenge, because he understood now what silence had cost people. The divorce proceedings with Celia remained private, painful but private. She had cooperated with investigators after the gala and provided documents that helped establish how information had been manipulated over the years. It did not erase what she had done to Ruth. It did not erase the months of humiliation, fear, and isolation. But it mattered. For the first time, she had stopped protecting the lie. The last conversation Nolan had with her was short. Neither pretended everything could be fixed. Some damage stayed. Some relationships became casualties of the truth they had avoided for too long. Yet when she apologized to Ruth, she did so without excuses. And Ruth had listened. Not because forgiveness was automatic, because dignity allowed her to listen without surrendering her boundaries. The biggest change happened inside Nolan. For years he had measured love through provision, a house, a trust fund, medical care, comfort. He had believed success could compensate for absence. Now he understood how wrong he had been. The realization hurt more than anything investigators uncovered. One afternoon he stood before a small audience gathered at a community center in Sacramento. Advocates, attorneys, adult adoptees, senior care organizations, journalists. He wasn't there as a billionaire entrepreneur. He wasn't there as a public figure. He was there as a son. His speech remained simple. He publicly acknowledged that while others had harmed Ruth directly, he had failed to notice because he was rarely present. He spoke about responsibility, about paying attention, about the dangerous assumption that money alone could protect the people who mattered most. The room stayed silent long after he finished. Then people stood, not for his success, for his honesty. Later that year, the Mercer Foundation announced 2 new initiatives. One focused on protecting vulnerable seniors from exploitation and fraudulent guardianship efforts. The other supported access to historical adoption records for adults seeking answers about their own lives. Nolan refused to place his name prominently on either project. Instead, both programs carried a different name, the Bellamy Initiative. When reporters asked why, his answer never changed: because none of this would exist without Ruth Bellamy. Meanwhile, Ruth became something she never expected: not famous, respected. Organizations invited her to speak. Legal advocates sought her advice. Families contacted her after hearing pieces of her story. The attention sometimes embarrassed her, but she accepted it because she understood it was never truly about her. It was about what she had protected. The document box remained locked for years because people assumed it contained money, inheritance, secrets worth selling. In reality, it contained something much more valuable: evidence, truth, proof that some lives mattered enough to preserve. One evening, Nolan drove across the estate as the sun settled behind the vineyards. The mansion stood in the distance, large, impressive, almost empty, but that was no longer where Ruth lived. Months earlier, contractors had completed a small cottage near a grove of oak trees on the far edge of the property. The place was modest, warm, private, entirely hers. Nolan had offered to restore her suite inside the mansion. Ruth declined immediately. The decision surprised many people, not him. He understood now. The mansion represented somebody else's idea of success. The cottage represented freedom. When he arrived, Ruth sat on the porch with a blanket across her lap and a cup of tea beside her. The evening air carried the scent of grapes and freshly cut grass. She smiled when she saw him. Not the tired smile he remembered from the carport, a peaceful one. The difference was impossible to miss. Nolan joined her on the porch. For several minutes neither spoke. They simply watched the sunset. Eventually Ruth broke the silence. "You still blame yourself?" It wasn't a question. Nolan stared toward the horizon. "Some days." Ruth nodded. "Good." He looked at her, surprised. A small smile appeared on her face. "Because it means you learned something." They both laughed softly. Then the laughter faded. Nolan's eyes drifted toward the cottage. "You could have moved back into the mansion." "I know. Why didn't you?" Ruth looked around the porch. The garden, the oak trees, the fading sunlight. Then she answered, "Because this house is mine." Such a simple sentence, yet it carried years of meaning. No one could move her out. No one could decide where she belonged. No one could erase her story. For the first time in a very long time, her life belonged entirely to her. Nolan felt something loosen inside him. A knot he had carried for years. The need to fix everything. The need to compensate for every mistake. Some wounds never disappeared completely. Some relationships never returned to what they once were. But healing didn't require perfection. Sometimes it simply required truth and presence. The two sat together until darkness settled over the estate. No investigations, no lawsuits, no hidden files, no secrets. Just a mother and son sharing a quiet evening they almost lost. The greatest inheritance Ruth had protected had never been money. It had never been property. It had never been a family name. It was the truth that allowed people to find themselves again. And now, finally, it belonged to the people who needed it most. If Ruth's choice had been yours, would you have returned to the mansion or chosen the little cottage? Share your thoughts below, and thank you for spending time with this story.